On a freezing winter day, a kind waitress gave two hungry orphans a bowl of soup and lost her job for it. 20 years later, June Ashworth's quiet life is interrupted when a sleek black Rolls-Royce pulls up and two strangers step out. They're Noah and Aria, the children she once saved, now grown and successful. What they reveal will clear her name, expose the lies that ruined her, and prove that one small act of kindness can change everything. June hadn't had a visitor in 10 years when that Christmas Eve rolled around in 2023. Not since the town called her a thief, not since the church called her worse. The whispers followed her like shadows in those days. I watched from this very window as neighbors crossed the street rather than walk past her little house on Maple Street. But on that particular Christmas Eve night, when that black Rolls-Royce purred up her broken driveway like a cat stalking prey, some debts don't stay buried forever. The two figures stepping out of that gleaming car carried the kind of reckoning that only comes when the hungry get fed and the liars get found. The headlights cut through the December darkness, illuminating her old soup kitchen sign, hanging crooked on its rusty chain. Sunshine Spoon. It had read once, back when the letters weren't faded and the hope wasn't gone. The paint was peeling now, 20 years of weather having taken its toll. But somehow those words still held power, still meant something to folks who remembered. A man stepped out first, his movements careful and deliberate. Even from my window 3 houses down, I could see he was tall and well-dressed, the kind of man who'd learned to carry himself with purpose. His gloved hand clutched something small and stained. My old eyes weren't what they used to be, but I could tell it was a napkin, old and yellowed with age. A napkin from 2003, as it would turn out. But why they'd waited 20 years to come back, and why Regina Voss's name was scribbled on that napkin in what looked suspiciously like dried blood, well, that's where our story truly begins. The woman who emerged from the passenger side moved with the grace of someone who'd fought battles and won them. Someone who'd learned that victory sometimes tastes like soup and sometimes like justice. Her hair caught the streetlight, and for a moment, I thought I was seeing a ghost. But ghosts don't drive Rolls-Royces, and ghosts don't carry briefcases full of legal documents that would topple an empire built on the suffering of children. You see, December 17th, 2003, was the day June Ashworth lost her job and found her soul. I remember it as clearly as if it were yesterday, because that was the morning my Irene made her last batch of Christmas cookies, before the cancer took her voice away. The snow was falling thick that morning, the kind that makes the whole world look clean, even when it's rotten underneath. From my kitchen window, I watched the flakes dance in the amber glow of the streetlights. Each one perfect and unique, just like the souls we meet in this life. June had been working the morning shift at Bluebird's Diner over on Commerce Street, pouring coffee for truckers and serving up eggs that had seen better days. It was honest work for honest pay, and June had never asked for more than that. She was the kind of woman who said please and thank you to everyone, who remembered how customers liked their coffee, who slipped extra bacon to the construction workers who reminded her of her daddy. Bluebird's wasn't much to look at. Truth be told, the linoleum was cracked, the booths were held together with duct tape and prayer, and a coffee machine made a sound like a dying cat when it was brewing. But it was warm and it smelled like home cooking. And for folks who didn't have much of either, it was a sanctuary. June understood that. She'd made it her mission to make sure everyone who walked through those doors felt like they belonged somewhere, even if it was just for the time it took to drink a cup of coffee. But then they walked in and everything changed. Noah and Aria, 7 and 9 years old, respectively, though their eyes looked decades older. They weren't beggars, mind you. Ghosts is what they were, with ribs like prison bars showing through their thin jackets and fingers so pale they looked translucent. Their shoes had holes that let the snow seep through, and Aria kept stomping her feet to keep the feeling in her toes, making little squeaking sounds on the worn linoleum. They stood by the door like they weren't sure they were allowed to come in, their eyes taking in the warmth and the smell of food with the kind of hunger that goes deeper than the stomach. Noah had his arm around his sister's shoulders, protective in the way that children learn to be when adults fail them. Arya clutched a paper bag that looked like it held everything she owned in this world. When June saw them huddled by the door, something stirred in her chest, something she hadn't felt since she was their age. Standing in the kitchen of Sister Margaret's orphanage, watching the other children fight over scraps, she remembered the taste of watered-down gruel and the ache of going to bed with an empty stomach. She remembered Sister Margaret's ruler across her knuckles when she was caught stealing bread for the smaller children. The memories came flooding back like a dam bursting. Sister Margaret had been a woman who believed suffering built character, that hunger taught gratitude, and that children were born sinful and needed to be purged of their wickedness through deprivation. "Stealing bread gets you the closet," the old nun would say, her voice sharp as winter wind, her eyes cold as January frost. "But sharing it gets you the strap." June could still feel the welts that strap had left. She could still remember the taste of her own blood when she bit her tongue to keep from crying out. But what Sister Margaret never understood was that every blow of that strap only strengthened June's resolve to be different, to be better, to be the kind of person who saw hunger and filled it instead of using it as a weapon. Looking at these two children, June saw herself 30 years back, all hollow cheeks and desperate hope. Without a word, she moved to the soup pot and ladled out the biggest bowl the diner had. Thick with vegetables and chunks of beef that cost more than her hourly wage. The soup was her own recipe, something she'd been perfecting for months, adding herbs and spices she bought with her own money to make it taste like love felt warm. She slid the bowl across the counter along with a basket of crackers and 2 glasses of milk that she'd pay for herself if she had to. The milk was fresh and cold, the kind of white that promised nutrition and comfort. She added a pat of butter to the crackers, knowing that sometimes it's the small luxuries that remind us we're human. Arya's eyes went wide as saucers when she saw that feast spread before them. She grabbed a handful of crackers and stuffed them in her sock with the quick, furtive movements of someone who'd learned that food was never guaranteed. "For later," she whispered, as if speaking too loud might make the bounty disappear like a mirage in the desert. Noah said nothing, just stared at that bowl like it was the Holy Grail itself. His hands shook as he picked up the spoon, and I imagined June could see the prayer of gratitude in his eyes, the kind of thanksgiving that comes from the very depths of the soul. When he took that first sip, his whole body relaxed for maybe the first time in months. Earl Redding, the dishwasher, who'd been working at Bluebird's since before televisions were in color, shuffled over and watched the children eat. He was a man of few words, carved from granite and weathered by time. But when he did speak, folks listened. His hands were scarred from years of washing dishes in scalding water, and his back was bent from decades of standing over industrial sinks. But his eyes were sharp and kind. "Kid," he said to June, his voice rough as sandpaper dragged across concrete, "you just fed 2 wolves." He nodded toward the office. "The problem is, one of them is named Regina, now." Regina Voss was the kind of woman who wore her cruelty like jewelry, all shiny and displayed for the world to see. She managed the day shift at Bluebird's with an iron fist wrapped in a silk glove. And she had eyes like a hawk and twice the mean streak. She'd been watching June and those children from across the diner, her red lipstick pursed in disapproval that could freeze coffee in the cup. Regina believed in rules the way some people believe in religion, with zealous fervor and no room for interpretation. There was a rule about not serving people who couldn't pay, a rule about portion control, a rule about everything that might interfere with the profit margin. She kept those rules written down in a little notebook she carried, adding new ones whenever she caught someone showing too much humanity. Her office was in the back of the diner, a cramped space that smelled of cigarettes and cheap perfume. The walls were covered with employee schedules, health department certificates, and photographs of Regina with various local dignitaries. She kept a calculator on her desk at all times, constantly running numbers, always looking for ways to squeeze more profit from less investment. But June had learned something important in those orphanage years, something that Regina would never understand. Kindness ain't free. It's a debt the world collects with interest, and the interest rate varies depending on how much love you put into the principal. And sure enough, as those children finished their soup and warmed their hands on the empty bowl, Regina's scream cut through the diner like a knife through silk. "Where's the cash?" The tip jar was gone. $2,347 that June had been saving for her mother's Christmas present had vanished like smoke in the wind. It wasn't much money, not to most folks, but to June, it represented hours of refilled coffee cups and patient smiles, small kindnesses that added up to something meaningful. Regina's painted nails left moon-shaped cuts on June's arm as she grabbed her French manicure drawing blood from skin that had already been weathered by years of honest work. "I saw you with those little thieves," Regina hissed. Her breath smelled of coffee in spite of something rotten underneath. "You're all in it together, aren't you? Running some kind of scam on my diner." The accusation hit June like a physical blow. In all her years of working, in all her years of serving others, no one had ever questioned her honesty. Her integrity was the one thing she'd managed to keep intact through all the hardships of her life. The one treasure that couldn't be stolen, lost, or broken. The police came within the hour, their boots heavy on the cracked linoleum. Their questions were sharp and suspicious. Officer Rafael Mendez was kind enough, but Officer Trent Sawyer had the look of a man who'd already made up his mind before he walked through the door. They took statements from Regina, from Earl Redding, and from the 3 customers who'd been in the diner when the jar disappeared. The children were long gone by then, vanished into the December cold like they'd never existed at all. But the empty bowl remained on the counter, a testament to the meal that had started this whole chain of events. June stared at that bowl while the officers questioned her, wondering if she'd somehow brought this on herself by daring to show compassion. The manager came next, Mr. Curtis Ellery, a thin man who looked like he'd been pressed flat by the weight of corporate expectations. He'd been running Bluebirds for 15 years, and in all that time, he'd never had an employee accused of theft. His hands shook as he filled out the paperwork, as if the very act of firing someone might contaminate him with their supposed dishonesty. By evening, there was a pink slip in June's locker and a notice that read, "Terminated for theft," in Regina's careful handwriting. But the real crime wasn't the missing money, though that stung deep enough. The real crime was that napkin, the one June had used to wipe Aria's chin when the child had dripped soup on her jacket. Later, much later, June would remember the details that didn't make sense at the time. The way Regina had lingered by the children's table after they'd left. The way she'd picked up that napkin and examined it closely before stuffing it in her apron pocket. The way she'd smiled when she thought no one was looking, a smile that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with satisfaction. That napkin had Regina's lipstick print on it, sure enough, but it also had something else. Numbers written in what looked like Noah's shaky child's handwriting. Numbers that, when arranged correctly, formed the combination to the diner's safe. Numbers that no customer should have known. Numbers that Regina herself had written down and left carelessly on the counter that morning when she'd been rushing to make the bank deposit. The security cameras in Bluebirds were old and unreliable. And wouldn't you know it, the footage from 3:07 p.m. that afternoon was mysteriously corrupted. Technical malfunction, the company said when the police asked to review the tapes. Happens all the time with equipment that old. Earl Redding knew better though. As June cleaned out her locker that night, her hands shaking with a mixture of rage and heartbreak, he shuffled over with his characteristic limp and whispered words that would haunt her for years to come. "Moira's brother runs the shelter those kids vanished from," he said, his eyes darting toward the kitchen where Regina was counting the day's take with unusual thoroughness. Funny how kids keep disappearing from there and Moira keeps getting bonuses for operational efficiency. The pieces of a larger puzzle were scattered around them, but June was too hurt and too shocked to put them together just yet. All she could think about was the unfairness of it all. The way 20 years of honest work could be erased by one moment of compassion gone wrong. That night, as June made her way home through snow that had shifted from lovely to lethal, she caught one last sight of Noah and Aria. They were being lifted into a Child Protective Services van, their small shapes swallowed by the official-looking adults around them. Aria wept, her tears turning to ice on her cheeks in the brutal cold. But Noah didn't cry. He stared straight at June through the rear window of that van, his young face fixed with a resolve that seemed far too old for 7. His lips formed 2 words she would never forget. 2 words that would ring in her head for the next 20 years. "We'll be back." The van slipped into the night, ferrying those children back toward the nightmare they'd once escaped. And June stood under the drifting snow, asking herself if she'd just witnessed her own undoing or theirs. Dawn delivered news that froze her blood and cracked her heart anew. Sunshine Spoon, the small soup kitchen she'd scrimped for and dreamed about, was condemned by the city. The building she'd put a deposit on the place she meant to feed anyone in need was suddenly deemed structurally unsound. An inspector's report surfaced overnight, sprouting like mushrooms after rain, signed by Inspector Gavin Langford, conveniently married to Regina's cousin. The condemnation carried a second signature from Deputy Mayor Preston Carrick, who just happened to be Regina's new beau and soon-to-be spouse. In a wedding society, pages would brand the event of the season. Curious how love and politics curl up so easily together. How cash and clout swirl like cream in coffee. June's deposit, every dollar scraped from 5 years of double shifts and skipped dinners vanished per the lease's fine print. No refunds for acts of God or municipal decree. Facing that taped-off building on the morning of December 19, 2003, June felt something inside her go quiet. Not her compassion, not her drive to serve, but her faith in the system that should protect people like her, the system meant to honor hard work and restrain those who prey on the vulnerable. The wrecking ball arrived before sunset. As if the city couldn't wait to erase every trace of June's hopes, she stood with the onlookers and watched 2 decades of planning and prayer collapse into dust and broken brick. The roar of demolition was deafening, yet she still heard her own voice, telling a bank officer how she would feed anyone who walked through her door. When the dust settled and trucks hauled the rubble away, June caught sight of 2 familiar faces in the crowd. They weren't weeping like neighbors who knew her plans. They weren't even mournful. They were counting. Their lips moved with each slab that fell, each wall that yielded. And June realized they were storing it all. Later, much later, she would grasp that Noah and Aria were cataloging every detail of that ruin, filing it beside every injustice witnessed, every cruelty endured. Even at 7 and 9, they were building a case, gathering proof for a reckoning 2 decades distant. With no job, no references, no prospects, and no hope in a town that had branded her a thief, June's soup kitchen vision shrank into something humbler and more immediate. A grocery cart liberated from a parking lot. A portable hot plate salvaged from a thrift shelf. A wobbly card table that somehow held steady under the weight of hope, pitched beneath the Morrison Street Bridge where homeless veterans gathered, and the city's forgotten found shelter from weather and from respectable eyes. The concrete was layered with graffiti telling histories of love and loss, of deferred dreams and broken vows, and still there was beauty there. Murals by artists who knew that truth can rise from the darkest ground. The homeless veterans who met there became her guards. Men and women who'd seen too much war and too little peace, who knew what it meant to be discarded by the very country that once hailed them as heroes. Sergeant Owen Riker lost his left leg in Desert Storm and his family to the aftershocks of coming home. Eleanor Pruitt served 3 tours in Vietnam as an army nurse and returned to a nation that spat on her uniform and forgot her name. "You fed my kid, lady," Raul told her on a raw January night, eyes kind beneath the scars that crossed his face. Nico was one of those kids you slipped extra pancakes to on Sundays. "Now we feed you." They formed a circle around her makeshift galley. These battered soldiers who knew the real battles are fought with mercy rather than weapons, carried water, shared cans from their meager stores, and stood watch while she cooked, ensuring no one harassed the woman who chose to feed others even when she could scarcely feed herself. In a dented recipe box wrapped in plastic against the rain, June kept more than directions. Every napkin with a thank you. Every scrap where someone had scribbled a name to prove they existed. Every small token from people she'd served. The box became a vault of dignity, evidence that kindness given finds its way home. There were letters from truckers who remembered her coffee, from college kids who scrounged coins for meals during finals, from single mothers who brought their children to Bluebirds because it was the only place they could afford to feel normal. Each paper told a story, and each story mattered. At the bottom of the box, sealed like a relic, lay a photograph she'd found skittering on the wind after the wrecking ball finished. Maybe someone dropped it or tossed it, assuming no one would see. But June saw, and she picked it up. What met her eyes turned her blood to ice. Regina passing a thick envelope to director Malcolm Pritchard, the head of CPS, both smiling like they'd just sealed a lucrative deal. They stood outside the Cedar Ridge Group home, the state facility where Noah and Aria supposedly lived before wandering into Bluebirds that December morning. The timestamp read 2003, one day after Noah and Aria were pulled back into the system. One day after June lost everything. One day after Regina Vos got exactly what she sought. For 10 long years, June ladled soup from that cart beneath the Morrison Street Bridge. She served laid-off laborers, students whose aid had run dry, runaways who aged out of foster care with nowhere to go. She fed retired teachers whose pensions had vanished, disabled vets waiting on benefits that might never come, and immigrant families whose American hopes collided with the fact of poverty. Each bowl carried a story, and each story settled in June's bones like silt in a riverbed. She came to understand she wasn't only feeding bodies. She was feeding souls, nourishing the piece of humanity the world preferred to ignore. Yet late at night, when the bridge was empty save for traffic overhead and the wind whistling through steel, doubt slipped in. Was she saving souls or drowning her shame in a sea of hunger no ladle could fill? The questions cut deepest when officers told them to move, when officials seized her cart over health codes, when well-meaning neighbors complained about the unsightly cluster of desperate people near their neat, safe streets. Some nights she lay on her cart at the women's shelter and wondered if Regina Vos had been right, if she was enabling those who should be helping themselves. But morning came, and someone approached with hollow eyes and empty hands, and June remembered why she began. Soup, she learned, isn't just food. It's proof. Proof someone saw you when the world looked away. Proof you mattered when everything else said you didn't. Proof that love can be measured by the tablespoon and served hot when everything else has gone cold. The years slipped by, each one bringing new faces and the same old needs. June's bright hair silvered to gray, then white, and the endless motion of ladling and stirring left her joints aching with arthritis. Her back bent from hauling water and folding tables. Her feet flattened from standing on concrete day after day. Still her smile held. Her ladle stayed full. Her trust in ordinary goodness somehow outlasted the world's cruelty. Then, on a Tuesday in March 2013, fire tore it all apart. Nearly 10 years to the day since she lost her job at Bluebirds, June had just served lunch to about 40 people when Brandon Keats, a veteran wrestling with addiction and his own ghosts, stumbled too close to the propane tank with a lit cigarette. The blast was quick, if not huge. Flames raced through her setup, devouring months of careful work in minutes. The shopping cart, hot plate, and foldable table, her humble altar of service, were reduced to ash and twisted metal before firefighters arrived. The worst loss was the recipe box, a treasury of gratitude. 2 decades worth of notes and napkin scribbles, proof of impact, proof of kindness returned, gone in a breath. As the fire raged, Toby Kerrigan, with second-degree burns on his face and arms, kept apologizing, lips cracked and trembling. "I'm sorry, Miss June," he repeated as they lifted him into the ambulance. Even with her heart breaking, June gripped his burned hand and whispered, "It's all right, honey. Things can be replaced." "You can't." Captain Ana Castillo, the investigator, found June on a broken slab of concrete, staring at the ruins. "I'm sorry for your loss," Castillo said softly, and meant it. She knew the difference between losing possessions and losing purpose. Yet not everything burned. Amid charred metal, one thing survived: a business card. Its edges were singed, but the print remained clear. Voss Holdings, creating solutions for tomorrow's challenges. Cream paper, elegant, carrying weight. On the back, a note: "See her home, monthly payments, keep quiet." Faded but legible. June's pulse quickened. The card pointed to something long buried: Cedar Ridge Group Home, the place where Noah and Aria had vanished 2 decades earlier. Monthly payments could only mean one thing: someone was being paid to stay silent. The card was tied to Regina Voss's empire, the one built on the misfortune of others. It became June's compass. Every morning, she woke determined to rebuild what the fire had destroyed. At night, she lived in the public library, combing through public records, tax filings, and old reports until her eyes burned. Mrs. Sujin Han, the elderly librarian, would bring coffee and gently urge her to rest. "You're looking for something specific," Mrs. Han said one evening as June rubbed her eyes. "Justice," June answered, the word landing heavy. As she dug deeper, she found a story that made her stomach twist. Voss Holdings tax returns revealed a framework built on human suffering. A line in the 2012 filings read, "Dining Solutions, $12,000 per month from Cedar Ridge Group Home, year after year." The truth beneath those numbers was uglier than she imagined. Cedar Ridge wasn't just a stopover. It was a place where children worked in kitchens serving other state institutions, and where funds meant for their care were siphoned off. Records showed money intended for children's nutrition routed to Voss Holdings for consulting, which amounted to teaching hungry kids to cook food they weren't allowed to eat. The deeper she went, the worse it became. Cedar Ridge took state money, but the children weren't receiving an education or proper care. They labored in industrial kitchens. They saw a nurse practitioner with a tarnished record, and the funds for their meals flowed elsewhere to Voss Holdings. All roads led to one person, Regina Voss, now married to the deputy mayor. Regina had built a vast empire on the misery of vulnerable children. But there was a twist June hadn't foreseen. Noah and Aria hadn't just survived. They flourished. Noah, using only a smartphone app, founded Nourish, an organization that turned restaurant surplus into free meals for families. By 2020, Nourish had grown into a multi-million-dollar force, outstripping Voss Holdings' ambitions. Aria became a fierce child advocacy attorney, fighting the very system that failed them. She launched Ashworth and Associates, a firm devoted to cases no one else would touch, named for a diner worker who once showed her grace. Together, Noah and Aria collected evidence against Regina and her brother for years. They were patient, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. When it came, they wouldn't merely topple Voss Holdings. They would dismantle an empire of cruelty. That Christmas Eve, June's quiet life was broken by a black Rolls-Royce. It hadn't always been hers. It once belonged to Regina Voss. Now the car was in June's hands, along with the deed to a prized downtown property. It was a small victory, but not why they came. Arya stepped out, her polished composure cracking when she saw June. For a breath, she was 9 again, gripping a paper bag, grateful for soup and a stranger's kindness. They brought more than money, they brought justice. The napkin from the Fayum diner, the one that started everything, was now sealed in plastic, preserved as evidence. When the story finally broke in January 2024, the press named it the Soup Kitchen Scandal. But for those who had been watching, it was a reckoning 20 years in the making. A reminder that sometimes the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, but sometimes it needs a little help. Words are just air until they're backed up by evidence. And the evidence that Arya and Noah had compiled over 2 decades was devastating in its scope and damning in its detail. Financial records showed money meant for children's meals being diverted to personal accounts. Medical records revealed systematic neglect and abuse. Employment records showed children as young as 8 being used as unpaid labor in commercial kitchens. The recording that Arya played for the packed courtroom was 20 years old, but the digital restoration technology that Noah's company had developed made every word as clear as if it had been spoken yesterday. Regina's voice, younger but just as cold, outlined her plan to use the group home children as free labor while collecting full payment for their care. "Those kids are worth more working than eating," Regina's recorded voice said with clinical detachment. "Let them think that soup kitchen woman stole their money. Keeps them grateful and keeps them quiet. And if any of them get too mouthy, well, we could always arrange for them to disappear into the system somewhere else. Who's going to miss a couple of throwaway kids?" The community revolt that followed was something to see. An uprising of conscience that reminded everyone why democracy sometimes works despite itself. Homeless families stormed the city council chambers, carrying signs with June's picture and testimonials about meals she'd served under that bridge. Former group home residents, now adults with families of their own, came forward with stories that made hardened reporters weep. "She fed us," they chanted, their voices echoing off the marble walls of power, bouncing back at the politicians who'd enabled Regina's system of abuse through their willful blindness and corrupt complicity. "She fed us when nobody else would. She saw us when nobody else cared." The mayor, faced with overwhelming evidence of his administration's complicity in 20 years of systematic child abuse, called an emergency press conference where he announced his immediate resignation. The deputy mayor, Regina's husband, was arrested before he could follow suit. The city council voted unanimously to void every contract Voss Holdings had ever received, and the state attorney general announced a criminal investigation that would eventually reach into dozens of similar facilities across the region. But Noah's testimony was the bomb that leveled Regina's empire entirely. The killing blow was delivered with the precision of someone who'd been planning it for 20 years. His forensic accounting, backed up by teams of investigators and data analysts, proved that Voss Holdings had embezzled $2.8 million from school lunch programs over the past decade. Money meant to feed children was redirected to Regina's personal accounts, vacation homes, and luxury cars. The numbers were staggering, but it was the human cost that truly broke hearts in that courtroom. Noah spoke in a voice that remained steady despite the tears streaming down his face, describing how he and his sister had been forced to work 16-hour days in commercial kitchens, preparing thousands of meals for school districts while being fed nothing but thin gruel and stale bread. "We made food for other children while we starved," he said, his words carrying the weight of years of accumulated pain. "We prepared birthday cakes for school celebrations while we forgot what cake tasted like. We packaged lunches for field trips we would never take to places we would never see, for childhoods we would never have." Arya's testimony was equally devastating, but delivered with the clinical precision of someone who'd learned to weaponize her pain in service of justice. She detailed the systematic abuse that went beyond mere hunger, describing how children, who complained or asked questions were punished with solitary confinement, how medical care was withheld as a form of control, and how education was replaced with labor that generated profit for Regina's empire. "They didn't just steal our food," Arya said, her voice cutting through the silence of the packed courtroom like a blade through cloth. "They stole our childhoods, our health, our futures. They turned us into commodities, bought and sold and traded like livestock. And when we dared to dream of something better, when we dared to believe we deserved more than scraps and cruelty, they made sure we knew our place." The climax came on the third day of testimony, when Regina, finally realizing that her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her like a house built on sand, lunged across the courtroom at June in a final act of desperate rage. She moved like a woman possessed, her face twisted with 20 years of accumulated hatred for the person who'd shown kindness when Regina had demanded only submission. But June, weathered by 20 years of serving soup to desperate people and strengthened by decades of choosing love over fear, caught Regina's wrist with hands that remained steady despite everything she'd endured. The courtroom held its breath as these two women faced each other across 20 years of pain and injustice. Predator and prey switched roles at a moment that felt like cosmic justice finally asserting itself. "You starved them," June said, her voice calm as still water, carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "You took children who had nothing, and you gave them less than nothing. You turned their hunger into your profit and their pain into your pleasure. I saved you the trouble of having a conscience." The judge, a stone woman who'd seen too many cases of institutional abuse, but never one quite this systematic, sentenced Regina to 15 years in federal prison and ordered full restitution to every child who had been harmed by her operation. The amount was staggering, over $40 million when accounting for lost wages, medical costs, psychological damage, and punitive damages. But money, as important as it was, couldn't undo 20 years of trauma. What mattered more was the symbolic victory, the knowledge that someone had finally been held accountable for treating children like commodities instead of human beings. What mattered was the message sent to every other Regina Voss operating in the shadows that their time of reckoning would come. The mayor, faced with his own corruption charges and overwhelming evidence of his administration's complicity, held one final press conference before disappearing into federal protection and a plea deal that would keep him out of prison in exchange for his cooperation. At that conference, with shaking hands and a voice that cracked with something that might have been genuine remorse, he tore up every eviction notice his office had ever served against June's various soup kitchens. And Noah, tears streaming down his face as he watched 20 years of planning finally come to fruition, handed June a key. Not to the Rolls-Royce, though that was part of the package. Not to money, though there was plenty of that too. The key was to something far more valuable. Something that represented the completion of a circle that had begun with a bowl of soup on a snowy December morning. The new Sunshine Spoon opened 6 months later in the heart of downtown, a gleaming facility that looked like a restaurant but operated like a mission. The building had been Regina's headquarters, the place where she'd planned her empire of exploitation. But now it hummed with the sound of industrial mixers preparing soup for anyone who needed it. The kitchen was state-of-the-art, capable of serving 500 meals a day, but it was designed with dignity in mind. The dining room looked like a real restaurant with tablecloths, flowers, and music playing softly in the background. There were no lines, no numbers, no degrading processes designed to make people feel ashamed of their hunger. There were just tables and chairs and servers who understood that food is love made visible. The gold plaque by the door read simply, "No one leaves hungry," but underneath, in smaller letters that most people missed unless they were looking for it, were the words that really mattered, in memory of every child who went to bed hungry and in hope that no child ever will again. Even Regina, working off her community service in the kitchen while serving the first year of her sentence under a work release program, Learned something about the dignity of honest labor and the satisfaction of feeding others instead of feeding off them. She worked in silence, mostly, her designer clothes replaced by a simple apron, her manicured nails broken from honest work. At first, she did the work with resentful compliance, going through the motions without understanding the mission. But gradually, something began to change. Maybe it was seeing the gratitude in people's eyes when they received a meal. Maybe it was finally understanding what it meant to give instead of take. Or maybe it was simply the weight of 20 years of accumulated guilt finally finding a constructive outlet. One evening, as they were closing up the kitchen, Regina approached June with something that might have been an apology, struggling to escape from lips that had never learned how to form such words. "I don't know how to say sorry for 20 years, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. June looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had caused so much pain, who had turned cruelty into a business model and suffering into profit. Then she handed Regina a ladle and said simply, "Start with tomorrow's soup." Sophia adopted a little girl from Cedar Ridge Group Home during the facility's closure. A child with hollow eyes and two thin arms who reminded everyone of two orphans who'd walked into a diner 20 years before. The girl had been in the system for 3 years, passed from home to home, failed by every institution meant to protect her. "Her name's June," Sophia announced at the grand opening celebration, the little girl clinging to her hand like a lifeline while taking in the warmth and abundance of the new sunshine spoon with eyes that couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. "And she's going to grow up knowing that the world has people in it who will feed her when she's hungry and hold her when she's scared." The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. Here was the cycle completing itself. Trauma transformed into healing. Pain converted into purpose. The little girl would grow up in a world where Regina Voss's empire of exploitation had been replaced by June Ashworth's legacy of compassion, where the very building that had once housed meetings about maximizing profit from human misery now served free meals to anyone who needed them. Earl Redding, now 94 and still sharp as the day is long despite his bent back and slow shuffle, came to the grand opening ceremony, leaning heavily on a walker, but refusing all offers to sit down. He'd outlived Bluebird's Diner, outlived the 3 owners, and outlived his own expectations of how long a dishwasher could keep going on stubbornness and spite. He shuffled up to June during the ceremony. His eyes were still bright despite the clouded cataracts, and he delivered his verdict on 20 years of struggle and redemption. "Kid," he said, his voice still rough as sandpaper dragged across concrete, "you fed the wolves, and they remembered. Funny how that works when you give instead of take." Perhaps the loveliest moment arrived on a snow-dusted December night, precisely 20 years after that first bowl of soup that set everything in motion. June was locking up the kitchen when she heard a hum drifting from the dining room. A tone so clear and tender, it made the air itself seem to shimmer with gladness. There sat Sophia, now a thriving mother, softly humming, "You Are My Sunshine," while her daughter colored at a table. The child pressed bright yellow crayons to paper, sketching what looked like a steaming bowl of soup whose spirals rose and curled into musical notes. "My grandmother sang that to me at the first orphanage," Sophia said when she noticed June in the doorway. "Before hunger got so heavy, we forgot how to sing. Before we learned music was a luxury we couldn't afford, you gave it back to us. The ability to recall joy, the permission to hope for better things." June's eyes brimmed with tears she'd held for 2 decades salt water that tasted of vindication, sorrow, and gratitude all at once. All those years of uncertainty. All those nights asking if she'd done the right thing. If a single bowl of soup could matter in a world crowded with cruelty and indifference, here was her answer, humming gently beneath warm light in a kitchen filled with hope instead of want. The old recipe box was gone, burned in that fire long ago. But June had learned the most vital recipes aren't written anyway. They pass from heart to heart, from one hungry soul to the next, in the quiet act of seeing a need and choosing to meet it. They're measured not in cups and teaspoons, but in compassion and courage, seasoned with justice and served with the awareness that we're only temporary, stewards of whatever abundance we're blessed to hold. Feed one mouth, you save a body. Feed a soul, you save a lineage. As I set down this tale, seated in my chair by the window where I've watched a century turn, I can see Sunshine Spoon from here. Its lights never dim, the door never locks, and steam rises from the kitchen like prayers lifting toward heaven. The building glows with warmth against December's dark beacon, and reminder for anyone who needs to know kindness still lives in a world that sometimes forgets how to care. Sometimes late at night, when snow falls and the world is quiet save the wind threading bare branches, I see a black Rolls-Royce glide to the curb. Two figures step out. No longer the hollow-eyed children they were, but accomplished adults who never forgot where they came from or who carried them through the worst. They roll up their sleeves and ladle soup for whoever arrives, their faces reflecting the same gentleness June once gave them. Noah, now in his late 20s, moves through the kitchen with the economy of someone who learned early how precious food can be. He's grown Nourish into service in 12 cities, partnering with formerly homeless neighbors to run local sites, creating work for people who understand hunger from the inside out. His company delivers more than meals. It delivers dignity, respect, and the radical belief that everyone deserves to eat well, regardless of ability to pay. Aria works with city and state leaders to repair child welfare, using her legal training and lived experience to draft laws that put children's well-being ahead of institutional ease. She's helped pass measures tightening oversight of group homes, expanding nutrition funding, and increasing penalties for those who profit from child abuse. Together, they built a foundation in June's name, granting aid to soup kitchens and pantries nationwide. But beyond money, they offer something you can't tally: hope. Hope that systems can bend, that justice can stand, that kindness planted in darkness can grow into something bright and transforming. The Rolls-Royce itself has become a small legend. Noah had it resprayed from black to sunlit yellow, and Aria had free meals inside, printed across the doors in letters no one can miss. It's no longer mere transport. It's a moving banner for redemption's power. A traveling reminder that tools once used by the corrupt can be remade into instruments of healing. And sometimes, if you listen closely, when the wind is right and the night is very still, another sound rides the air from that kitchen, not just ladles knocking and broth bubbling, but something else. Something that sounds a lot like hope, like mending, like the faint echo of a 9-year-old girl's voice humming, "You are my sunshine," while she colors bowls of soup and dreams of a world where no child is hungry. The veterans from beneath the Morrison Street Bridge still gather now and then, though most have homes thanks to programs Aria helped launch. They come to Sunshine Spoon not for the food, but because they remember when June fed them from a shopping cart with more heart than supplies. They come to honor a woman who knew dignity matters as much as nourishment, that recognizing someone's humanity is as vital as filling their stomach. Sergeant Carlos Menendez, his prosthetic now cutting edge thanks to veterans benefits Aria helped secure, works part-time at Sunshine Spoon as security. Not because the place truly needs a guard, but because he wants to shield the woman who sheltered him when all he had left was hunger and pride, too stubborn to ask. Eleanor Pruitt, the Vietnam-era nurse, runs the clinic inside, offering basic care to anyone who walks in. She's seen too much pain to refuse a soul, and she knows hunger and illness often waltz together in poverty's long dance. Her clinic follows June's rule: no questions, no judgment, only help for whoever needs it. The anniversary of their first shared bowl has become the neighborhood's unofficial holiday, a day the community gathers to remember how one generous act can echo for decades. The celebration isn't ornate or loud. It's a common table where everyone shares, where the served become the servers, where former rivals break bread in a reconciliation no one could have imagined 20 years ago. Regina, 3 years into her sentence and genuinely changed by service, wrote a letter June keeps framed in her office. It isn't lyrical. Regina was never deft with words unless she wielded them like blades, but it's honest in a way that cuts through legal polish and courtroom spectacle to touch something essential about our capacity to change. I spent 20 years building an empire on other people's hunger, she writes in her neat hand. I told myself I was helping, offering structure and discipline to kids who needed guidance. But I was really feeding my own appetite for power and control. You showed me the line between taking and giving, between using people and serving them. I can't undo 20 years of harm, but I can try to spend what's left balancing the scales. The letter goes on to map her plans after release, how she used her business skills to strengthen groups like Sunshine Spoon, and her promise to atone not only through restitution, but through service. She signs simply Regina Vos, as if she's learned at last to claim both halves of herself instead of hiding behind titles and borrowed names. So the next time you pass a soup kitchen, or notice someone hungry on the sidewalk, or witness a small kindness that seems minor in the grand scheme, remember June Ashworth and 2 orphans who learned love can be ladled from a bowl and served with crackers on the side. Listen closely. You might hear your name in the steam, calling you to remember that in a world crowded with Regina Vosses, each of us can choose to be June Ashworth instead, to see hunger and fill it, to meet loneliness and warm it, to find despair and offer it a chair at a table where all are welcome and no one leaves empty. Because that's the truth about soup kitchens. They're not really about the soup. They're about the kitchen, the place where strangers become kin, where the broken are mended one meal at a time, and where ordinary people discover they can change the world one bowl at a time. The torn apron June wore during the bridge years now hangs framed in the new Sunshine Spoon kitchen, a reminder that the most important uniform is often the one stained by service. Each morning, as the staff arrives to prep the day's food, they touch that frame for luck, carrying forward the legacy of a woman who proved that the smallest kindnesses can echo for decades, transform lives, and move mountains of indifference, carving valleys of compassion where none existed before. The recipe for that first bowl, the one that set everything in motion, has been recreated and perfected by Sunshine Spoon's head chef, a former Food Network personality who walked away from television to feed people who couldn't pay. It's called June's Special, and it uses ingredients you can't measure: a cup of compassion, a tablespoon of hope, a generous portion of human dignity, and love enough to feed anyone who's hungry. Every serving carries that same charge, that same intent, that same refusal to accept that anyone should go hungry in a world of plenty. The steam curling from those bowls brings more than the scent of vegetables and broth. It carries the promise that someone cares, that someone sees you, that someone believes you deserve to eat regardless of circumstance or ability to give back. Sunshine Spoon now has 7 sites across 3 states, each staffed in part by people once served there, people who understand hunger from the inside and refuse to let others endure what they did. The model has spread to other groups, weaving a network of compassion across the country like a web of hope. But it began with one woman who saw 2 hungry kids and decided rules mattered less than hunger, profit less than people, her comfort less than someone else's urgent need. It began with a choice that seemed small, rippling outward like rings on a pond, touching lives in ways she could never have foreseen. And as I sit here, watching snow fall past my window on another December night, I still see those circles widening. I see Sunshine Spoon's warm lights piercing the dark, promising hot sustenance to anyone who needs it. I see the yellow Rolls-Royce at the curb, its bright color a cheerful refusal of the shadow it once cast. Most of all, I see hope that systems can change, that justice can hold, that individual acts of kindness matter in ways we may never fully grasp. Hope that in a world that sometimes seems designed to crush the vulnerable, there will always be people like June Ashworth who choose compassion over convenience, service over self-interest, love over fear. The steam still rises from that kitchen every night, carrying with it the prayers of the fed and the hopes of the hungry. And somewhere in that steam, if you listen with your heart instead of your ears, you can hear the voice of every soul who was touched by kindness when they needed it most. You can hear them saying thank you. You can hear them saying they remember. You can hear them promising to pass it on. And in a world that too often forgets the power of simple human decency, that promise echoes louder than any symphony, more beautiful than any song, as enduring as the love that first filled a bowl with soup and changed the world one spoonful at a time. Years passed, and June's legacy continued to bloom in the quiet corners of the world. Sunshine Spoon wasn't just a soup kitchen anymore. It had become a movement, a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of one person's kindness to change the world. Noah and Aria, once the hungry children who had been fed by a stranger, had become the architects of a new world. Through Nourish and their legal advocacy, they transformed the lives of countless others, ensuring that no child would ever go to bed hungry again. As the seasons changed, the lights of Sunshine Spoon never dimmed. The staff, many of whom were once recipients of June's kindness, now served others with the same warmth and compassion they had received. They knew the value of a simple meal, the power of being seen, and the unspoken bond that connected them all. On the anniversary of that first bowl of soup, June stood at the front of the bustling kitchen, her heart full. She had seen it all, the darkness, the struggle, and the triumph. She had come full circle, not just as a woman who fed others, but as a beacon of hope, showing the world that kindness, though often small, could move mountains. And so each night, as the steam rose from the pots of soup, carrying with it the echoes of gratitude, June whispered a quiet prayer. May we never forget the power of one bowl, one person, and one act of love. In the warmth of that kitchen, surrounded by the people whose lives she'd touched, June knew one truth above all: kindness never fades. It simply grows, multiplying in the hearts of those who choose to pass it on. The winter after the yellow Rolls-Royce first parked at the new Sunshine Spoon, the city hung a small bronze plate beneath the sign, Ashworth Commons. No speeches, just neighbors, a few veterans in worn coats, and steam breathing from the vents like a quiet choir. Someone hummed "You Are My Sunshine," and people drew closer without being asked. The underpass by Morrison Street wasn't a hiding place anymore. The murals were sealed. A pocket garden grew where the shopping cart once stood. On one wall, a painted ladle poured a river of soup that turned into a ribbon of names: truckers, students, nurses, anyone who had signed a napkin to say "I was here." Noah built a digital archive and called it the recipe box. It held notes, not measurements. Thanks, not temperatures. Aria's reform slate, soon nicknamed the Sunshine Axe, tightened oversight, locked nutrition funds to the child, and banned labor disguised as care. She rarely raised her voice. The record spoke for her. Regina kept showing up, even after the sentence ended: pots, onions, crates. No cameras, no statements. June's rule held: no questions, no judgment, just work. Sophia's daughter, little June, grew tall enough to reach the prep table. She learned to season by smell and to slide a second roll across a plate when eyes couldn't meet hers. On the night the 7th Sunshine Spoon opened, she read the plaque aloud. By no one leaves hungry. A bus driver was crying into his sleeve. The Rolls-Royce became the Sun car. Trunk open on Saturdays. Take what you need. Leave what you can. Tell someone where to find us. Kids treated it like a landmark. One late December, the keys felt heavy in little June's palm. They do at first, the elder June smiled. That night she slept in the small room above the kitchen and didn't wake. Morning paused at the doorway, then moved. A hand to the framed apron, stock burners lit, Someone humming. Service that evening turned into a memorial without a microphone. Veterans lined the wall. A student parked a diploma on the counter for the light. A city worker delivered a paper renaming the span beneath the bridge, June's. Table and ordered seconds. Noah slid a napkin under the kotozuka. Ladle date and name in blue ink. Evidence fed us. Love kept us alive, he said, then stirred the pot before it skinned. The work widened. Nourish rescued produce at the farm gate, not just the back door. The foundation taught night classes on site, so no one had to choose between a shift and a future. The clinic added a tiny dental chair. A church hosted laundry nights where the cost was a story, and the telling made it lighter. When a storm knocked out the power, Sunshine Spoon ran on a generator and candles. Spoons tapped enamel. Snow shook from hats by the door. In the hush between sounds, a child's voice found the note that steadied the room. Goodness arrived like steam ordinary, warming, enough. The lights returned. The line moved. And the sign by the door kept its promise. No one leaves hungry.